Steve Garvey, Keith Hernandez, Mookie Wilson, they all had front row seats to watch him build a career defined by conflict and questionable choices. The packaging says he was pathetic. And when you look at what these legends actually witnessed, you start to understand why that label stuck. Because the story of Bill Buckner is not just about one error. It is about a man who seemed to create the conditions for his own destruction. 19 days before the moment that would define his life, Bill Buckner sat down for an interview, October 6, 1986. A reporter asked him about the pressure of the postseason. His answer was chilling. The dreams are that you are going to have a great series and win. The nightmares are that you are going to let the winning run score on a ground ball through your legs. Those things happen, you know? I think a lot of it is just fate. Think about that for a second. He literally described the exact scenario that would happen. The media would later use this quote to frame his error not as a physical mistake, but as a psychological collapse, a self-fulfilling prophecy. And maybe they had a point, because when you look at Buckner's career, the 1986 error was not some random act of fate. It was the final domino in a long chain of conflicts, bad decisions, and physical compromises that all pointed toward one inevitable conclusion. Years later, after the Red Sox finally won in 2004, fans wanted to offer Buckner forgiveness. He rejected it. "I feel like the guy who got put away for a crime he did not commit," he said. And then the DNA evidence comes back 30 years later and the guy gets out of jail. What do you say for the 30 years he spent suffering? I do not feel like I have committed a crime. But here's the thing. When you examine the DNA evidence, when you look at the conflicts and choices that shaped his career, you realize that while Buckner might not have been the only guilty party, he definitely played a role in his own conviction. The nightmares he described were not just bad luck. They were the predictable outcome of decisions he made, conflicts he created, and a stubbornness that would not let him accept his physical limitations. Let me show you what the legends saw. The story really begins in Los Angeles, long before Boston, long before that ground ball. 1968. The Dodgers draft class was legendary. Bill Buckner, Steve Garvey, Ron C., Davey Lopes. Future stars all selected in the same year. Buckner was a gifted athlete. He played first base. He was highly regarded as an outfielder, too. By 1973, after Wes Parker retired, Buckner had moved to first base full-time. This was his position. This was his future. Then there was Steve Garvey, the photogenic, fan-friendly, media-accessible All-American success story. Problem was, Garvey could not throw. He was a disaster at third base. So bad that rumors started circulating that his days in the Dodgers organization were numbered. His career was not looking good. Except for pinch hitting, he seemed to have no path forward. Manager Walter Alston had a lineup problem, and someone suggested a solution. That someone, according to Buckner himself, was Bill Buckner. Here is what Buckner said about it. The Dodgers tried Steve Garvey at third base and at left field. Except for pinch hitting, his career was not looking too well. I suggested this to Alston, and rest assured, I never played first base again. Alston moved me to left field. Read that again. I suggested this to Alston. Buckner actively suggested the move that would displace him from his own position. Garvey took to first base like a duck to water. He became the anchor of the durable Dodgers infield. He won multiple Gold Gloves. Meanwhile, Buckner was pushed back to the outfield. And here's where the negative angle really kicks in. This was not just a career setback. This move had a direct causal link to what happened in 1986. Playing the outfield exacerbated a chronic ankle injury. Those ailing ankles, the ones that would fail him 13 years later, started getting worse because he gave up his natural position to help save Steve Garvey's career. The conflict with Garvey was not just a rivalry. It was the origin point of Buckner's eventual physical breakdown. He helped create the very injury that would make him unable to field that ground ball. You want to talk about poor decisions? Buckner essentially sacrificed his body to help a competitor. And Garvey, the man he saved, went on to become a legend while Buckner hobbled through the rest of his career on ankles that never fully recovered. Think about the long-term consequences of that one suggestion. Buckner gave away his natural defensive position. First base is easier on the body than outfield. Less running, less lateral movement, less stress on joints. The outfield requires constant movement, quick bursts of speed, sudden stops and starts. All of that wears down the ankles over time. Buckner spent years doing that wear and tear, years that added up, years that created the chronic soreness that would define the final stage of his career. By 1986, those ankles were so damaged that Buckner needed high-top cleats just to play. Think about that. He could not even wear normal baseball shoes. He needed extra support just to walk on the field. And this all traced back to June 23, 1973, the day he suggested Garvey play first base. The day he volunteered to sacrifice his body for someone else's career. But the Los Angeles years taught Buckner something else too. Something that would also come back to hurt him. Toughness. His minor league manager was Tommy Lasorda. Lasorda loved Buckner. When Buckner died, Lasorda mourned him as one of the greatest ever. What did Lasorda love about him? His legendary, almost pathological competitiveness and toughness. Lasorda told a famous story. Buck broke his jaw and the front office told me to sit him out for 5 weeks. Buckner missed only one game and wound up hitting .335 and learned to spit and swear with his jaw wired shut. This was the gamer identity, the workhorse, the guy who never sits out. Lasorda cultivated this trait and praised it, and Buckner built his entire identity around it. Here's the irony. That toughness, that refusal to sit out, is exactly why Buckner stayed in Game 6 of the 1986 World Series. By that point, he was 36. His ankles were shot. He needed high-top cleats just to manage the pain. His manager had a healthy defensive replacement on the bench. But Buckner, the tough guy, the gamer, stayed in. He refused to accept a defensive substitution. The very identity that Lasorda praised, that made Buckner feel like a warrior, became his liability. If you like honest baseball analysis, hit that subscribe button now because we're just getting started with how this whole thing fell apart. His toughness was not a virtue, it was stubbornness. And it facilitated his public ruin. So now we arrive at 1986, Game 6 of the World Series. The moment everyone remembers, except the version everyone remembers is wrong, because Buckner's error was not the failure. It was just the final visible mistake in a cascade of collapses that started long before he ever touched the ball. Let me walk you through what actually happened, and let me show you how everyone from the manager to the pitchers to the media built the trap that Buckner would fall into. First, the manager, John McNamara. His failure was the most egregious because it directly enabled everything that followed. Throughout the entire 1986 postseason, in all 7 of the Red Sox victories, McNamara had a pattern, a strategy. He pulled Buckner in the late innings for a defensive replacement, Dave Stapleton. Stapleton was a utility man on the roster specifically for this purpose. Every single time the Red Sox won, McNamara made this substitution. Game 6, the most important defensive inning of the season, the 10th inning, 1 out away from a championship. McNamara froze. He abandoned the strategy that had gotten him there. He left a physically compromised Buckner in the game. His excuse? Sentimental. He wanted Buckner, the veteran, to be on the field when we won. That was his first explanation. When people criticized this reasoning, McNamara changed his story. Years later, he tried to protect himself by attacking his other player. He claimed he did not trust Stapleton. He said Dave Stapleton's nickname was Shaky. And you know what that implies. This is the smoking gun. The Shaky claim was a lie, a fabrication. An analysis shows that Stapleton had committed a total of 1 error in 3 seasons. 1 error in 3 years, and McNamara had the nerve to call him shaky to justify his own managerial malpractice. McNamara was willing to slander a player's reputation to cover his own failure. This is the toxic, blame-shifting environment that made a single scapegoat necessary. And McNamara made sure it would not be him. But before we even get to Buckner's error, let me tell you about the pitcher who actually blew the game, Calvin Schiraldi. Reliever. He came into the bottom of the 10th inning with a 5-3 lead. The Red Sox were 3 outs away from winning the World Series. Schiraldi retired the first 2 batters. 1 out away, then he completely collapsed. 3 consecutive 2-out singles. Gary Carter, Kevin Mitchell, Ray Knight. The lead was cut to 5-4. The tying and winning runs were on base. Schiraldi was the pitcher who blew the lead, not Buckner. Schiraldi. And it gets worse. Schiraldi took the loss in Game 7. He allowed 3 runs in just 1/3 of an inning. By any objective pitching metric, Schiraldi, not Buckner, was the GOAT of the series. But his failure was immediately erased by the visual drama of what happened next. The media ignored him. They needed a simpler story, and Schiraldi was not it. Here is something interesting about Schiraldi. He had been acquired from the Mets. Think about that irony. The Red Sox got him from the very team they were playing against, and he ended up blowing the series for Boston. You would think that detail would be part of the story. The former Met coming back to haunt his old team, except he helps them instead. But no, the media buried that narrative. It was too complicated. They wanted something clean and simple. So McNamara finally pulled Schiraldi. He brought in Bob Stanley to face Mookie Wilson, and Stanley immediately made everything worse. With Knight on second and Mitchell on third, Stanley uncorked a wild pitch. It was a clear miscommunication with catcher Rich Gedman. Stanley said Gedman set up outside for a pitch intended to be inside. Other players claimed Gedman expected a sinker but got a fastball. The pitch was so errant that Mookie Wilson had to dive out of the way. It was scored a wild pitch, though many critics argued it was a passed ball that Gedman should have blocked. The result? Kevin Mitchell scored from third. The game was tied, 5-5. Read that again. The game was already tied before Mookie Wilson hit the ball to Bill Buckner. Buckner's error did not cost the Red Sox the lead. Stanley and Schiraldi had already lost it. Buckner's error only hastened the loss that had already been secured by the pitchers. But here is the most insidious part. One fan account claims to have seen a clip of Stanley in the clubhouse after the game. Stanley was allegedly deflecting blame and saying something like, "If Buckner gets that." If that account is true and multiple sources reference it, then Stanley immediately and actively pointed the media narrative toward Buckner to absolve himself of the wild pitch that tied the game. Stanley threw Buckner under the bus before Buckner even made it to the clubhouse. Let me break down the blame here because it matters. Schiraldi surrendered 3 consecutive 2-out singles. He blew the 5-3 lead. He allowed the tying and winning runs to reach base. The media largely ignored him. McNamara left an injured Buckner in the game and failed to use Stapleton. He abandoned his winning strategy. He later deflected blame onto Stapleton by calling him shaky. Stanley threw a wild pitch. The tying run scored because of him. He deflected blame to Gedman and to Buckner. Gedman failed to block the wild pitch. Some criticized him, but Stanley's pitch was deemed not catchable. And then Buckner. Fielding error on Wilson's grounder. The winning run scored from second base. He became the sole GOAT and symbol of the curse. You see the problem? 5 different failures. 5 different people who contributed to the collapse, but only one guy took the blame. And that guy was the one who made the final, most visible mistake. Not the most important mistake, just the one everyone could see. Now let me show you what the Mets legends saw from the other dugout, because their criticism is even more damning. Keith Hernandez, Mets first baseman, when he made the second out of the 10th inning, he was so convinced the game was over that he gave up. He walked off the field, he went down the tunnel. He retreated into manager Davey Johnson's office to watch the end of the game on television. He thought it was done. Think about what that means. The Red Sox had a 99% win expectancy at that moment. They did not just lose. They achieved a failure so total and so improbable that their opponent's star player had already conceded. Hernandez later discussed the play in terms of a total defensive breakdown, Buckner's positioning, Stanley's failure to cover first base. The Red Sox did not lose because of fate. They lost because they fell apart. Then there is Mookie Wilson, the man who hit the little roller. Wilson and Buckner later became friends. But Wilson's baseball analysis has always been a criticism of the single error narrative. Wilson and his teammates have consistently maintained that even if Buckner had fielded the ball cleanly, Wilson's elite speed would have made it a toss-up at first base. If Buckner had fielded the ball and lost the race to the bag, the game would have continued. Tied 5-5. Runners on first and third. This is critical. The curse story hinges on the idea that Buckner's error was the singular game-losing moment. Wilson's analysis suggests that the Red Sox's late-inning defense was so physically compromised, Buckner's ankles, and so psychologically broken, Stanley's wild pitch, that the Mets' victory was tactically inevitable. Even without the error, Boston was collapsing. Wilson's speed meant Buckner was probably going to fail no matter what he did. So Buckner was trapped. His ankles, damaged from years in the outfield after giving up first base to Garvey, made him slow. His tough guy identity, forged by Lasorda, kept him in the game when he should have been pulled. His manager abandoned the winning strategy. His pitchers collapsed before he ever touched the ball. And even if he had made the play, the odds of getting Wilson out were questionable at best. But the media needed a villain, and they found one. Except they had to ignore a few things to make the story work. Dwight Evans, Red Sox legend, all-star, beloved. In Game 4, with the series tied 1-1, Mets hitter Lenny Dykstra hit a long fly ball to right field. The ball hit the heel of Evans's glove and bounced over the wall for a home run. The broadcast announcer noted the image of Evans leaning against the wall in frustration is worth more than 1,000 words. The Mets won that game 6-2. Evans's error tied the series 2-2. Let me be clear, both Buckner and Evans, 2 veterans, committed defensive miscues in the World Series. Both plays contributed to losses. Yet Evans's error was forgotten. Buckner's became the symbol of 68 years of failure. Why? Because Evans was a beloved homegrown star. Buckner was a former Cub, an outsider, and he was wearing a Cubs batting glove under his mitt during the error, visually linking him to another cursed franchise. He was the perfect expendable GOAT. Let me talk about that Cubs connection because it matters more than you might think. Buckner was not a Red Sox lifer. He did not come up through their system. He was not born and raised in Boston. He played for the Dodgers, then the Cubs. He spent 7 seasons in Chicago. He wore their uniform, he became their player, and then he came to Boston in 1984, just 2 years before the World Series. 2 years. That is not enough time to become a true Boston icon. Not in the eyes of the fans, especially Red Sox fans who value homegrown loyalty above almost everything. Buckner was an outsider, a hired gun, a player they acquired, not one they developed. And when things went wrong, that outsider status made him easy to sacrifice. But it gets worse. That Cubs batting glove, the one he was wearing under his mitt during the error. The cameras caught it. and fans noticed. Here was a Red Sox player in the World Series representing Boston, and he was wearing a piece of Cubs equipment. For some fans, that was the ultimate betrayal. It was visual proof that Buckner was not really one of them. He still had ties to Chicago. He still identified with another franchise. Even in the biggest moment of his Boston career, he could not let go of his past. Now, to be fair, lots of players wear equipment from different teams. It is common. It means nothing. But when you are looking for reasons to blame someone, when you need a scapegoat, these little details become ammunition. The Cubs glove was not the reason Buckner became the villain, but it was a symbol that fans could point to, evidence that he was never really a Red Sox player at heart. And here is the kicker. The Cubs themselves had their own curse, the curse of the Billy Goat. They had not won a World Series since 1908, so Buckner became a bridge between two curses. Two franchises defined by failure. The narrative wrote itself. The cursed player from the cursed team bringing his bad luck to another cursed team. It was too perfect, too clean. The media could not resist. The media did not just report on a scapegoat. They created one. The evidence was there. The complete collapse of Schiraldi, the game-tying wild pitch by Stanley, the managerial malpractice of McNamara, the forgotten parallel error by Evans. All of it was available, but that complex reality was too good to pass up. It was sacrificed for a simpler, more dramatic narrative. The curse of the Bambino personified by one man. A routine ground ball going through the legs of a player who had already vocalized that exact nightmare. It was a story too clean to fact-check. The Boston media and fan base were ruthless. Buckner and his family were subjected to a living hell. Effective exile? The media replayed the error thousands of times. Context be damned. They actively catered to and fueled the blind hatred that defined Buckner's life. They deliberately withheld evidence for decades. They prosecuted him in the court of public opinion and made sure he stayed convicted. Let me tell you what that living hell actually looked like, because the media's role did not end with the error. It was just beginning. The visual of the error became inescapable. Every sports broadcast, every highlight reel, every discussion of curses or failures or chokes. There was Buckner, legs apart, ball rolling through, Ray Knight crossing home plate, over and over and over. The media turned a 3-second moment into a cultural touchstone. They made it impossible for anyone to forget. And more importantly, they made it impossible for Buckner to escape. The replays were constant, relentless. Every October when the playoffs started, there was Buckner. Every time a team choked, there was Buckner. Every time someone made an error in a big moment, there was Buckner. The media used his failure as the universal symbol of athletic collapse. They turned him into a punchline, a cautionary tale, a ghost story that baseball told itself over and over. And each replay was a fresh wound, because Buckner had to watch it. His family had to watch it. His children had to see their father defined by the worst moment of his life. Imagine being Buckner's kid in school, having to defend your father while every sports show in America replayed his error, having to hear other kids laugh about it, having to pretend it did not hurt. The media profited from his misery. They used the clip to drive ratings, to sell documentaries, to generate controversy and clicks. Buckner's pain became their product, and they showed no mercy in exploiting it. They did not care that he was a human being, that he had a family, that the constant replay was destroying his life. They only cared about the story, the narrative, the curse. But here is what made it worse. Remember that interview from October 6th? The one where Buckner described his nightmare about letting a ground ball through his legs? The media weaponized it. They took a moment of honest vulnerability, a player admitting his fears, and they used it to construct a narrative of psychological weakness. They framed Buckner not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man who manifested his own failure, as if talking about a fear somehow made you responsible for it coming true. ESPN even made a documentary about it, Catching Hell. They framed Buckner's quote as evidence of a psychological collapse. They used it to suggest that Buckner had somehow cursed himself, that his nightmare was a premonition, a self-fulfilling prophecy. The documentary did not focus on McNamara's failure or Stanley's wild pitch or Schiraldi's collapse. It focused on Buckner and his quote. It turned his honesty into his biggest liability. Think about how twisted that is. A player gives an honest answer about the pressure of postseason baseball, He admits what every player fears, and when that fear becomes reality, the media uses his honesty against him. They turned his words into evidence of mental collapse. They made it seem like Buckner had cursed himself, that his nightmare quote was proof he was psychologically fragile, that he deserved what happened because he had imagined it first. That is not journalism. That is character assassination. And the fans? They followed the media's lead. Buckner received death threats. His family was harassed. The hatred was so intense that Buckner and his family eventually left Boston. They went into what can only be described as exile. Not because Buckner wanted to leave, but because staying meant subjecting his wife and children to constant abuse. The media created the narrative, the fans enforced it, and Buckner paid the price. Think about what that exile meant. Buckner had to leave a city where he had played baseball, where he had teammates and friends, where he had built a life. He had to uproot his entire family because the environment became too toxic to survive. That is not just losing a game. That is losing your home, your community, your sense of safety and belonging. And the economic cost was real too. Buckner lost endorsement opportunities, lost speaking engagements, lost the chance to have a normal post-playing career in Boston. Other players retired and became beloved local figures. They did radio shows, opened businesses, became part of the community fabric. Buckner got none of that. His error cost him not just his reputation, but his livelihood, his future, his ability to capitalize on a 22-year career of hard work. Now let me talk about 2004. The Red Sox finally won the World Series, broke the curse. And suddenly, Boston fans wanted to offer forgiveness. They invited Buckner to throw out the first pitch at the home opener in 2005. The media covered it like some kind of redemption story, like Buckner was finally being released from prison, finally being pardoned. Buckner went along with it. He threw the pitch, he waved to the crowd, but his words told a different story. I feel like the guy who got put away for a crime he did not commit. And then the DNA evidence comes back 30 years later and the guy gets out of jail. What do you say for the 30 years he spent suffering? I do not feel like I have committed a crime. That quote reveals everything. Buckner rejected the premise of forgiveness. Because forgiveness implies guilt. It implies you did something wrong and now you are being absolved. Buckner was saying no. I do not accept your forgiveness because I was not the one who committed the crime. You convicted me. You ignored the evidence. You destroyed my life over something I did not do. And now you want me to be grateful that you are letting me back in? The audacity of Red Sox fans thinking they had the right to forgive him. After they chased him out of the city. After they tormented his family. After they made his life hell for 18 years. They won a World Series and suddenly decided Buckner deserved peace. As if their forgiveness meant anything. As if they had the moral authority to grant it. And here is the thing that makes Buckner's anger even more justified. The media never corrected the record. Even after 2004, even after the redemption tour, the mainstream narrative never changed. Buckner was still the GOAT. The error was still replayed. The full context was still ignored. McNamara's failure, Stanley's wild pitch, Schiraldi's collapse, Evans's forgotten error. None of it became part of the popular story. The media had their villain and they were not letting go. Buckner spent the rest of his life fighting that narrative, doing interviews, explaining what really happened, pointing out all the failures that preceded his error. And some people listened. Some analysts and writers started acknowledging the fuller picture, but it did not matter. The damage was done. The image was burned into public memory. Buckner's legacy was sealed. He died in 2019. And even in the obituaries, even in the tributes, the error was always mentioned. Sometimes it was the headline. The error defined him more than his 22-year career, more than his 2,700 hits, more than his all-star selection. The media made sure of that. They turned one moment into an entire identity. They convicted him in the court of public opinion and never let him appeal. And what about the others? What happened to McNamara and Stanley and Schiraldi? McNamara eventually got fired, but not immediately. He managed part of the next season. He later got other coaching jobs. He was criticized for his Game 6 decision, but he was never vilified. He lived a quiet life, and when he died, his obituary mentioned the series, but he was not defined by it. Stanley played a few more years. He was booed sometimes, but nothing like Buckner. He stayed in Boston, had a normal post-career life, no exile, no death threats. Schiraldi bounced around a few teams and then retired. He was barely remembered for his role in the series. The media let all of them off the hook. They focused all their energy on one man. That is selective scapegoating. That is narrative construction. And that is why Buckner's crime metaphor is so powerful. He was not just blamed for something that was not entirely his fault. He was deliberately chosen as the fall guy while others who failed worse were protected. The prosecution withheld evidence. The judge was biased. The jury was rigged. And Buckner served the full sentence while the real criminals walked free. Let me give you one more piece of context that shows just how unfair this all was. Buckner had a 22-year career. 22 years. He played from 1969 to 1990. He accumulated 2,700 hits. He had a career batting average of .289. He was an all-star. He won a batting title. By any measure, he had a successful career. A career most players would dream of having. But none of that mattered. None of it was remembered. Because the media reduced his entire career to 3 seconds. 3 seconds out of 22 years. Think about that ratio. Over 2 decades of professional baseball, thousands of games, tens of thousands of at-bats. Countless defensive plays, all of it erased by one error. That is not fair. That is not reasonable. That is not journalism. That is narrative obsession. And the media knew what they were doing. They knew Buckner had a long, successful career. They knew he was a good player. But that did not serve the story they wanted to tell. The story of the curse required a villain, a symbol, a single moment that encapsulated 86 years of Red Sox failure. Buckner's career accomplishments did not fit that narrative, so they ignored them. They buried them. They made sure that when people thought of Bill Buckner, they only thought of the error. So let me bring this all together. The crime metaphor that Buckner used. The idea that he was put away for something he did not do. Is it accurate? Here is what we know. Buckner's career was defined by negative interactions and poor choices. He was positionally compromised by Steve Garvey, a move that directly led to the ankle injuries that hobbled him in 1986. He suggested that Garvey take his spot, his own decision. He was a victim of the toughness ethos Tommy Lasorda championed, an identity that kept an injured player on the field when he should have been pulled. He built that identity himself, embraced it, refused to let go of it. In the 1986 World Series, he was the final visible domino in a systemic collapse. But he was only the final domino because Schiraldi blew the save, because Stanley threw the tying run home, and because McNamara abandoned a winning strategy and later lied to cover it. He became the scapegoat because the media ignored the equal and greater failures of franchise icons like Evans. So was Buckner wrongfully convicted? Not entirely. He made mistakes. His stubbornness kept him in the game. His physical limitations, created in part by his own decisions with Garvey, made him unable to make the play. But was he the only one who failed? Absolutely not. Was he even the person who failed the most? Not even close. The negative angle here is that Buckner was a man who spent his career creating the conditions for his own downfall. He gave away his position. He destroyed his ankles. He built an identity around toughness that became stubbornness. He stayed in a game he should have left. And when everything collapsed, he was standing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, looking like the perfect person to blame. His conflicts with Garvey, his choices under Lasorda, his refusal to accept his limitations, they all fed into the moment. And then the media, the manager, and the teammates made sure he took the fall alone. Buckner served time for a crime he only partially committed. The DNA evidence shows that McNamara, Schiraldi, Stanley, and the media were all accomplices. But Buckner's own decisions, his own conflicts, his own stubborn refusal to step aside, they were part of the crime too. He might not have deserved all the blame, but he definitely earned some of it. That is the story the legends saw. A man trapped by his own choices. A man whose conflicts and compromises built a legacy of failure. A man whose nightmare became reality because he spent his career walking toward it. The packaging was right. When you look at what the legends witnessed, when you see the conflicts and the criticisms, you understand why Bill Buckner became the symbol of a curse. Not because he was the villain, but because he was the convenient one. And maybe, just maybe, because he helped make himself that way. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of this story you think matters most. Was it McNamara's lie about Stapleton? Stanley's wild pitch? Or was it Buckner's decision to give Garvey his position in the first place? Let me know what you think.